The two harvests in the book of Revelation. This is Revelation chapter 14, verses 14 through 20. So far, John has described the age in which the gospel is going out. Persecution abounds, and the church experiences all sorts of distress. The tribulations of which John is a partaker. You can see that in Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. After describing the dragon and two beasts, he turns now to describe the result of the tribulation experienced in this world. The result is the harvests of the earth. The first harvest, we see this in Revelation chapter 14, verses 14 through 16. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. I want to stop there. After seeing the dragon and two beasts representing Satan and the heathen nations, Rome, and worldly religion, the imperial cult, and after seeing the saints gathered with the Lamb, Jesus Christ, John sees a white cloud. On the white cloud is one like a son of man. This is Daniel's prophetic language referring to the Messiah, Jesus Christ. You can see that in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. This Messiah wears a golden crown representing his majesty and kingship. He wields a sharp sickle, and Jesus Christ is the one who reaps the harvest of the earth. He is the reaper. Continuing through the passage. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe." And he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. In his vision, John sees an angel come out of the temple to tell Christ that the time for the harvest has come. The fruit of the earth is ripe. Christ swings his sickle over the earth and reaps the harvest. There is no indication here that the harvested fruit is removed from the earth in a secret sort of rapture. It is, though, harvested. Jesus taught about this first harvest in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, and then the tares became evident also, the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No. For while you are gathering up tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn." Again, that was Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Now, Jesus also instructed his disciples concerning the harvest during his bodily ministry. Seeing the people, this is Jesus, in Matthew chapter 9, verses 36 through 38, he felt compassion for them, because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest." When Jesus taught John about the harvest, the very harvest John now sees in his grand vision, Jesus revealed that the wheat and the weeds would be harvested at the same time. The weeds would be thrown into the fire before the wheat was gathered into his barn, and that he was sending out harvesters because the fields were ripe. In fact, Jesus came in the first century, after spending centuries before that preparing the harvest through national Israel. In the first century, Jesus came to reap his harvest. And this harvest began in the 1st century AD. People are being redeemed. Christ instructed his disciples to pray that workers would be sent into the harvest. Then in Matthew 10, Christ sent his disciples to reap a harvest. Once we become disciples of Jesus Christ, we become fellow workmen with him, harvesters in his field, which is still ripe today. Now, in the book of Revelation, we see the second harvest. This is Revelation chapter 14, verses 17 through 20. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar. And he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, Put in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth, and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. Another angel exits the temple to harvest the fruit of the earth. Like the fruit harvested by Christ, this fruit is also of the earth and grew alongside the fruit of the first harvest. Another angel, one who has power over fire, mind you, instructs the angel with the sickle to reap the earth. John's language clues us into the fact that the harvest is different, of a different form, of a different type than the first, and is destined for fire. The angel with the sickle swings his sickle and gathers the clusters of grapes. He throws the clusters into the winepress of God's wrath. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, Jerusalem, where the temple was located, and blood came out from the winepress up to horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles, or in Greek, 1,600 stadia. John's vision of the harvest to wrath is more detailed than his vision of the harvest to glory. It seems there are many more grapes. There are clusters of them. And these are destined for the winepress of wrath. There are more of those than of the fruit that will inherit the earth, of the harvest, the grain that will inherit the earth. The blood of the grapes of wrath is not little, but symbolically flows 1,600 stadia from Jerusalem up to a horse's bridle. That's almost as tall as a man. 1,600 stadia is either meant to be taken as a simple image to indicate a very long distance, or an apocalyptic number to mean more than sufficient, that's 1,000, a more than sufficient number of those who are unholy, that's the number 6, the number of a man. We also have the image of a winepress producing wine. This winepress imagery comes from Isaiah 63. Who is this? This is Isaiah 63, verses 1 through 6. Who is this who comes from Edom with garments of flowing colors from Bozrah? This one who is majestic in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. It is I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red, and your garments like the one who treads in a winepress? I have trodden the wine trough alone, and from the peoples there was no man with me. I also trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath, and their lifeblood is sprinkled on my garments. And I stained all my raiment, for the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption has come. I looked, and there was no one to help, and I was astonished, and there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought salvation to me, and my wrath upheld me. I trod down the peoples in my anger and made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Again, that's Isaiah chapter 63, verses 1 through 6. This is the imagery John has in mind when he talks about this winepress of God's wrath and the grapes that have been trod in this winepress of wrath. According to Isaiah's prophecy against Edom, God would redeem his people Israel by trotting down the peoples in his anger and making them drunk in his wrath, pouring out their lifeblood. John employs this prophetic imagery to describe the second harvest of the earth. In every case, both harvests happen in conjunction with each other. The redemption of God's people is accomplished alongside the damnation and destruction of God's enemies. As we saw, Jesus identified the timing of the great harvest beginning at the time of his public ministry. You can cross-reference Matthew chapter 9, verses 36 through 38, his parable there of the harvests. There are many who look for signs and wonders, and assume that the righteous will be raptured out before the wrath of God comes upon the people of the world. According to John and Jesus, the harvest happens simultaneously, beginning with Christ's incarnation. We are living during the time of the great harvests of the earth. This passage says nothing about a secret rapture, but everything about the reality of resurrection to both life and damnation. Christ has redeemed his chosen people, and the rest will be slaughtered. Like the prophecy against Edom, the blood of Christ's enemies will stain his robe. Such imagery speaks to the seriousness of rebellion against God and the persecution of God's chosen people. Remember, this is an image, symbolism meant to communicate the revelation of Jesus Christ. All of God's enemies will die and remain as a testimony about the person and work of God in Christ. And we are either in Christ, part of the first harvest depicted by John, or not, part of the second harvest depicted by John. And may the saints be encouraged. The enemies of God will not inherit the earth. God will have his vengeance. We will one day see the fullness of God's justice, a harvesting work that began at the incarnation of Jesus Christ, our Messiah, who won the victory on Calvary.